Welcome, audiences. Today we have another installment with interviews with composers. And today we're speaking with Lukas Ligeti, who is going to be our featured composer on our concerts coming up on February 26th at UPenn and February 27th at St. Thomas Episcopal Church. Welcome, Lukas.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
How are you doing today?
Crazy, but good. How about you?
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today and to introduce you to our audiences who are eager to meet you when you come here for the premiere of your work, Actaonella.
Eagerness is all mine.
Excellent. I wanted to start a discussion with you because a lot of composers sort of classify themselves by maybe style, say like minimalism or spectralism. Some composers classify themselves by their affiliation. Maybe they're teaching at an institution. Some by a genre, like a band composer or a percussion composer. Others by maybe the awards they've won, since I mentioned it just because we've just had the Grammys. So I wanted to know from you, how do you classify your music?
I don't. I really don't. I'm influenced by so many different types of music and so many different types of non-music, extra musical things. And I also really enjoy working in very different musical environments. But I guess there's certain questions that I ask myself and certain things I'd like to try out. And then I like to try these things out and ask these questions in different environments. So if I work, for example, let's say in the context of writing a piece for an ensemble that plays a fully scored piece of contemporary music, or I'm working with, let's say, traditional musicians in Africa, some of the underlying issues that I'm trying to work on and questions that I'm asking myself could be the same, but I'm interested to see how my answers and my findings change in these different environments. And of course, I rarely find answers to my questions, but what I do find is more questions.
Yes. I'd be curious to know more about those influences, especially you said the non-musical ones.
Well, there's so many. Other art forms, visual arts, architecture, literature, dance, there's so many, intermedia arts. Interestingly enough, the one art form that I don't feel that I have so much of a relationship with, which is, I'm saying it's a little odd because I think most composers do, is film. I'm not a big movie person, but other than that, I'm a huge, fan of the arts, science, math and physics, astronomy. Traveling is a huge thing for me. I've traveled a lot since I was a child. I still travel an excessive amount nowadays, and so seeing the world is a really important thing for me. But there's so many things. I mean, I have a 3-year-old son, so my son is a big influence, I think.
That's wonderful. I wonder if you could identify any more specific influences for the piece that we're going to be premiering.
That's actually a difficult question because I try to do something new in every piece. And so this piece begins with a kind of a series of intervals that's repeated a couple of times. And I was really just looking for something that sounds quite consonant, but not tonal. And I was experimenting around, and then I started experimenting. Well, I've been working quite a lot on, let's say, somewhat microtonal ideas, but not following a certain scale or anything like that, but much rather just detuning notes to create, for example, ambiguous triads that are neither major nor minor, something, all the things that have been done before, but I'm trying to combine them in new ways. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that have not been done before, but this specific thing has been done. But then kind of going from that in the non-microtonal realm, I started experimenting with just kind of putting a different spin on triads by putting them in different relationships to each other than would normally be done in tonal music. And I think that's where the beginning of that piece comes from. And then the rest sort of, then I contrasted that with a little chromatic melody that goes kind of in waves up and down, which corresponds to, you have sine waves in this piece. And the sine waves, they're sampled sine waves. And every sample consists of two sine waves that are very, very slightly detuned from one another and create beating frequencies. And that actually sort of gives the tempo of the piece. So I'm basing a lot of the metric aspect of the piece on these sine waves. And then I have this kind of, chromatic melody that should contrast with the more consonant aspects of the piece. That is also kind of a wave. It goes up and down within a very confined range. So those are kind of some of the basic ideas that go into the piece. But now if you ask me for specific influences, how that came about, I must say that I'm drawing a blank a little bit. I think that I wasn't really trying to emulate or thinking too strongly of anything else. Sometimes I just like to clear my mind, because I think for me it's very important to do something original and different from what's been done before, also by myself. And that I think can only be done by studying a lot of what other people do. Otherwise, you end up reinventing the wheel. But at the same time, then when push comes to shove, actually forgetting everything and just doing your own thing.
Well, I'm curious because I asked you about influences and you gave me this wonderful ingredients in this. So I want to explore that more with you. In particular, you mentioned the microtones. So, because you had spoken that you sometimes work with non-traditional instruments, and this is a fully scored piece for flute, clarinet, piano, violin, and cello. So how do you achieve the microtones? How do you ask the players to perform that?
In this case, it's extremely simple. I just asked them to play a quarter tone higher or lower than, with little arrows. This is just really just a quarter tone situation, but sometimes with longer melodic trends, kind of like glissandi and things like that, where maybe they're not quite exact, not quite accurate, and where they also illustrate tendencies for the melodies to go in certain directions. But it's an extremely simple, I don't even know if one can call that microtonality. It's just really a quarter, just really, sort of quarter neighbor and transitory quarter tones.
Well, I noticed in the score you asked the string players to press on their bows to bring the pitches up and down a little bit.
Actually, the pressing on the bow is more for the timbre, but not pressing very strongly. So pressing not to make noise, but to just make the sound a little rougher. But that'll also influence maybe the intonation slightly, but the intonation is more controlled by the position on the fingerboard than the bow position. But of course, that also has an effect.
I'm also curious about the effect that we hear right away is that you have the keyboard player, you have the left hand on a keyboard and the right hand on a piano. Could you tell me a little bit more about that sort of combination or division?
Well, all the keyboard does is play these samples of sine waves, and they're not present throughout the entire piece, but they're present throughout a good portion of the piece, playing these beating sine waves that basically give like a drone that implies a tempo that everyone follows. It doesn't have to be followed completely exact. It's not a metronome, but it's sort of a tempo backdrop to refer to. And of course, the piano is in its intonation very inflexible. So I like the idea of contrasting the slightly detuned notes coming from the other instruments and also the sine waves to the piano that holds its tuning. And of course, then it becomes quite a relative question: what is in tune and what is out of tune, right? So if you're hearing the quarter tone inflections from the other instruments, then the piano sounds out of tune in relation to that, and
Yeah.
that's fine.
Yes. Now, I'm wondering if you could sort of take us back to when did you compose this, and what were you thinking about during that creative process?
So I composed this in basically the late winter and spring of 2022.
Mhm.
It was a joint commission by Network for New Music and a group from Vienna called Ensemble Reconcile. And so they did the world premiere in June of last year. And
Yeah.
now this will be the US and the second time it's being played, second and third time. So that's cool. There was only one performance by Reconcile. And so I wrote that quite shortly before the performance. I finished it in at the beginning of June.
Yeah. Excellent.
And I
You
was kind of, oh, sorry.
please, please finish.
No, I was kind of a little bit all over the place during that time. I was in Johannesburg in South Africa for a while. I kind of divide my time between Miami and Johannesburg. Um, but then I was also in New York for a bit, and I was in Vienna for a bit. I actually finished it in Vienna. And yeah, so I kind of took it with me throughout the continents and was working on it, kind of in these again, in these different environments. And these were, of course, in this case, I'm just working by myself, but I think just being in these different places and at different desks of mine, certainly, it's always a composition is always a journey for me somehow.
Mm. Yeah, I mean that's interesting that the composition is a journey and the compositions lead to more journeys for you to hear your pieces. And now I
Of
am
course, I
curious,
can't always be, but in this case, I'm very happy to be able to. Yes.
I am curious to know more about your activities in Africa, and in particular your work with Burkina Electric.
Yeah, so my relationship with Africa has been a very, very long-standing one. Actually, it started when I was studying back in Vienna. I was studying composition, and I also went to hear some musicological lectures. And I happened into an ethnomusicological lecture by Gerhard Kubik, great ethnomusicologist from Austria and expert on Central and Eastern African music. And he was talking about the traditional court music of the kingdom of Buganda, which is nowadays in Uganda, which is an extremely interesting type of music that I didn't know about prior to walking into that lecture. And it completely changed my life, this lecture, because I thought about this and I thought, wow, here's music that deals with questions of music perception and cognition, also with ideas of ensemble interplay and things like that in a completely different way from anything, like in a fundamental, conceptually different way from anything that I'd known. Also, the relationship between music and word. And so then I started thinking, how can I, what can my response to learning about something like that be? What kind of independent creative ideas can I come up based on knowing about this kind of music, having an idea of how it works, but not wanting to imitate it or decontextualize it, but just using it as a very fundamental inspiration. And I came up with a couple of ideas in music that sounded nothing like this music, but whether, that I would never have been able to think up conceptually had I not been exposed to this music. And so this African music, in this case from Buganda, really kind of helped me take my first steps towards developing my own voice as an artist. So I have a huge debt to this type of music. And then I started investigating more types of African music and composing based on, again, ideas derived in a very, very, uh, you know, uh, free way, just from that very basic inspiration. And then a couple of years later, I was asked by the Goethe Institute, the German cultural
Mhm.
institutes. I guess there's probably a Goethe Institute in Philadelphia, no? Or they have in New York and
I don't know if
Washington,
we have a
D.C.
Goethe Institute here in
Yeah.
Philadelphia, but
And I'm not German, so I was really surprised that they contacted me. But then they invited me to go to the Ivory Coast and
Mhm.
work with traditional musicians there. So that's, of course, a completely different part of Africa and very, very different music. But I went there and had another life-changing experience because I met these musicians from all over West Africa, but living there in Côte d'Ivoire. And we had a short 2-week collaboration, but it went so wonderfully that by the end of those 2 weeks, we decided we had to continue working together. And so these people became friends for life. And we founded an intercultural ensemble together. And working with these people also then led to the beginnings of what today I call experimental intercultural collaboration, which is sort of the approach I've developed to creating jointly with people from completely different cultural backgrounds and trying to do something new in the process. So that group Beta Folie ran for a couple of years and then unfortunately ended due to lack of funding and a deteriorating political situation in the Ivory Coast. We never made it to the States, but we toured a lot in Europe. And then sometime later, I started this new group called Burkina Electric with basically with colleagues from my, that I'd already worked with, um, the singer Maïla Ngani and the guitarist Wende Kablas, and then we took 2 dancers also into the group. And this group is ongoing today. It's been around for 18 years, and we kind of explore, let's say, combinations of traditional music from Burkina Faso, which is right in the middle of West Africa, and that whole region, and electronics, particularly for dance electronica, but also increasingly experimental electronic ideas, and also other types of situations. For example, kind of our latest project is that I wrote a 1 hour long suite for Burkina Electric and Symphony Orchestra, which has so far been played in Europe, and we're doing it again, I think, later this year and next year, but has not yet made it to the States. But we have, as a group, as a band, we've played a lot in the States as well, and it's a project that I love working with my colleagues. We're like a family. We've known each other forever, and it's a wonderful thing to work on. But then I've also worked on projects in many other parts of Africa. For example, in Uganda, I finally got a chance to go there and work with musicians who are reviving this lost court music tradition in Buganda because of the political turmoil after the colonial time. That music got largely really uh, almost extinct, and now it's slowly coming back. And been doing a lot of work in Southern Africa. So I live part of the year in South Africa. And right now, what I'm mainly working on is that the ISCM, the International Society for Contemporary Music, asked me to, if the little organization called New Music South Africa that I am a part of in South Africa, it's like a new music advocacy organization, if we could host the upcoming World New Music Days, which is a very big festival
yes.
of the ISCM, and this would be the centenary edition of that festival, and also the first time it ever comes to Africa. And after initially being reluctant, they convinced me. So we're now trying to make that happen, and I think it'll be a really historic festival because I don't think there's ever been an overview of experimental and new music from all over the African continent. Most people don't associate Africa with new experimental, unconventional music, but in reality, there's a lot going on in that direction on that continent. But most people outside and even inside don't know about it. So we want to create this window on new music from Africa and start instigating exchanges between these musicians who are trying to do new things in Africa, um, and people from America and Europe and other places, other parts of the world. So this is something I'm very excited about. I'm the curator of this festival. We're busy fundraising now. We're really, really, really still in need of a lot of, support. And so that's something that I'm working on, and I hope it'll be something unlike anything we've ever seen before.
And when will that take place, Lucas?
End of November, beginning of December of this
Oh,
year.
of
So,
this year.
yeah.
Yes. Oh, exciting. Exciting. Well, I do want to ask you a little bit more about your own, how you integrate a number of elements in your pieces. Again, because you mentioned that Actaonella is completely written out, but improvisation is very much part of your identity. And I was wondering, you tell us a little bit more about how improvisation gets integrated into your creative activities.
Hmm. I'm not, I don't know what my identity is. I'm not a chameleon. I'm always, I think, true to my ideals and true to my interests. But I'm not busy trying to stake out any particular identity. And I actually am very strongly of the opinion that doing that is not necessarily productive. And I think that we are, generally in our current sociopolitical discourse, we are spending so much time discussing identity. And ultimately, what gets lost in all of that is the individual and individual's expression, which, of course, in art is an incredibly important thing, even if you're creating collectively and communally, which is something that I do a lot. But still, individual ideas come from individuals. And I think that we need to be careful not to get locked into our identities too much. So for me, life is a constant learning process. And it's therefore also a constant evolution of my identity, to the point that it's really not my concern what my identity is. I think it's the least interesting thing about me, and probably also about most other people. And what we think and what we say and what we do, that's what's important about us, and what we leave behind in this world. So that was a little deviation, but just because you triggered me with the word identity, so I had to.
Well, I perhaps should have chosen a different word. Is how
Yeah.
does improvisation as a practice play a role in your creative activities?
So it plays a role. I would always, I guess the best simple way to explain it is that um, composition and improvisation, for me, I have very different ambitions when I do one versus the other. Of course, I do a lot of combinations of the two as well. But in a certain way, improvisation in a group is an exercise in the loss of control to a certain extent. And composition is an exercise in control, would be saying far too much, because, of course, obviously, what the music ultimately sounds like, it's the musicians who play it who make that music sound. I'm just writing black dots on a piece of paper. And to make it, the interpretation of music is an incredibly rich world. That's why I think it's so superficial and unfair when I hear people complain about, the rigidity of classical music and things like that. No, I mean, why do we have, 250 recordings of, I don't know, a Beethoven string quartet? It's because actually people believe that they can contribute a new interpretation to that. So improvisation, you're in a certain sense, you're making it up as you go along, but in playing a written piece, there's also a lot that you're making up as you go along. So I see, I see these differences in a very nuanced way, but I also believe that composition for me is a lab for improvisation. I develop structures in composition, and then I can try to, again, take these into a different environment of, in this case, of improvisation, and see what happens. But at least as much the opposite. Improvisation is a lab for composing. So during improvisation, I come up with ideas spontaneously, maybe in a collective improvisation with other musicians, giving me ideas somehow. And then that stays in my mind. And I somehow think, okay, so can I, when I basically freeze this into a set condition now, how do I work with that? So they're very influential on each other, but what I'm not really interested is this idea of saying, oh wow, this piece sounds so spontaneous, it could have been improvised, because then I'm like, well, then I should have improvised it, and vice versa. Wow, this improvisation is so, that was sometimes when you improvise with people, you get comments like, oh, wow, this was such a good improvisation, it could have been composed. And then I ask myself, well, if people think that composition is somehow superior to improvisation as an approach, why are they wasting their times improvising? Uh, they should then they should just compose. And I really don't think that any of these methods are one is better than the other. I think they're just helpful, useful for uh, different circumstances and different results that you're looking to accomplish. And the same thing, though, also happens when I compose. That, initially I have no idea how I'm going to go about composing a piece, and I feel like a complete beginner. I'm incapable of. Then I think, oh wow, it could help if I put some music paper, or if I, click on the software or something like that to help me write something down. Usually it takes me about a week to figure that out. Before that, I'm just sitting there saying, oh my God, how am I going to do this? I have this idea in my mind, but what am I going to do with this? I can't do this. I have to give up. I need to, maybe I need to become a truck driver or something because I can't do this. And then, somehow it starts to work, but it's always a new process of discovery and a new process of teaching myself how to do it. So there's a lot of methodological thinking, but no set method.
Yeah, there is always something daunting about either a blank page or a blank screen, and until it gets going. You'd also mentioned, I think, that the lovely indeterminacies that are part of any composition and performance, and I think, I think the audience is particularly going to enjoy the ending of Actaonella in that lovely ethereal sounds that you create with those long pauses between the intervals and the notes, and it's just sublime. It's really wonderful.
Thank you. Although I don't think there should be pauses there. I mean, there's fermatas, but then it goes on.
Yeah, that's what I mean. The just the holding of that sound is just.
It's those intervals. I like those intervals, and I thought that I mean, one composer colleague, very highly regarded by me, came to the premiere in Vienna, and afterwards he told me that it was some kind of weird Gesualdo on acid, and I like that. I don't tend to kill people, so that is a difference. But I like that comparison. It didn't occur to me at all. But certainly, a Renaissance influence is certainly there. But so are many others, and ultimately, I hope that it's something that sounds independent. But yeah, I mean, these intervals are definitely something that I worked out while just kind of, fooling around on the piano.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I'm sure audiences are going to love this. Again, we're going to be featuring Actaonella by Lukas Ligeti on our concerts on Sunday, February 26th at 3 p.m. in Rose Hall at the University of Pennsylvania, and Monday night at 7:30 p.m. on the 27th at St. Thomas Episcopal Church. And I hope you'll all join us and get a chance to meet Lukas in person. So thank you, Lukas, for taking this time, and I hope everyone will join us for these upcoming concerts.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it and looking forward to meeting you all.